You're listening to Missing Persons, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, DNA ID, Zodiac Speaking, Scene of the Crime,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
The views and opinions expressed by guests on this podcast do not necessarily represent those of the podcast, its creators, or sponsors. If you would like to discuss a missing persons case on this podcast, please be sure to visit missingpersonspodcast.net. This episode may contain unsettling or disturbing subject matter. Listener discretion is advised.
If you'd like to support Missing Persons and get VIP access to things like ad-free listening, early preview episodes, and bonus content of not only this show, but for every other podcast on the AbJack network of indie podcasts, consider subscribing to the show with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcast. For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, you'll unlock a variety of listener benefits, and you'll be supporting the show in the process. Your support is greatly appreciated.
Welcome to Missing Persons, a podcast dedicated to spreading the word about people who have vanished under mysterious or unexplained circumstances and the family members who are looking for answers. I'm Jess Betancourt.
And I'm Mike Morford. Together, we created this podcast to help give a voice to people who continue to search for their missing loved ones. In some cases, even after decades have gone by. In each episode, you'll hear from Jess giving listeners the backstory and the basic facts of the disappearance.
Then Mike will speak with someone who's intimately connected to the missing person, and his guest will share their story with us. So sit back and enjoy this episode, and who knows, maybe you can help us find someone who's missing. Lawrence J. Riegel was born in Yakima, Washington on December 15, 1952, on the wedding anniversary of his parents, Charles and Cecilia Riegel. Larry, as he was called, was the middle child of 5 Riegel kids and had 4 sisters. One of them, Susan, is our guest today. The Riegels are a close-knit family rooted in Yakima, and Larry was a big part of that. He was described by everyone who knew him as gregarious and social, a people person, and chatty Cathy who could and would talk to anyone. He was also an outdoorsman and adrenaline junkie, embracing everything from water skiing to snowmobiling and hunting. As an adult, Larry was married twice, once in 1973 and the second time in 1978. Both marriages ended in divorce, but blessed Larry with his son Brian and his daughter Bree, with whom he was close. In December 2009, Larry was a contract pilot and was living in Yakima with his girlfriend, Ladena Mann. Larry had been living on a remote 10-acre farm on Lateral Sea Road between Fort and LaRue Roads in the lower Yakima Valley that had been in the Riegel family since 1962. Larry's mom, Cecilia, had lived there for years, and after she moved back into town in 2000, she gave the farm to Larry. Larry ended up renting out the farmhouse and property to a tenant recommended by his girlfriend Ladena and moving to Yakima to live with her. But things between the two were rocky, and Larry was contemplating extricating himself from the relationship. Larry last spoke with his family on Christmas Day 2009. He was supposed to attend a family dinner celebrating the holiday at Cecilia's on Boxing Day the 26th, but he never showed and he didn't answer his phone. Susan, Larry's sister, who was our guest, was very concerned. She considered herself very close with her brother. She loves to tell the story about the time when she was born. Larry took her to school for his first grade show and tell. When they were adults, Susan was Larry's bookkeeper for 2 decades. Well, Susan kept calling Larry on the 26th. Eventually, his girlfriend Ladena answered the phone and said that Larry had left the night before to visit friends on the coast. She said he was feeling blue. Susan asked Ladena to have Larry call her, but he never did. No one in his family ever heard from him again. By the 28th of December, Susan was due to head back home to Snohomish. On her way out of town, she stopped at Larry's house around 10:30 in the morning and spoke with Ladena. You'll hear Susan talk about that conversation. But Ladena reiterated that Larry had left on the 25th and would be back on the night of the 28th. She also rambled about how Larry was very concerned about money and maintained that the family owed her money. Susan only knew that something was very wrong. For the next week plus, the Riegel family kept trying to call Larry. Some reports say they called as many as 75 times, leaving voicemails and pleading that Larry call them. They called everyone Larry knew, reaching out to people in multiple states. Larry had a group of card-playing buddies in town. They hadn't heard from him. None of his hunting buddies had either. His typical haunts, like the James Gang Tavern and Old Town Pump Saloon in Union Gap, he hadn't been there. Friends he typically visited said he hadn't been to see them either. He had vanished. The family did not believe that Larry would leave on his own. As Susan described him on Facebook, quote, he was absolutely a family man. Larry was close with his 2 adult children, one of whom, his daughter Bree, had just gotten married a few months before. He wouldn't abandon Bree and Brian, or his sisters, or his mother Cecilia in her 80s at the time. Further, Larry had had neck surgery a few weeks earlier, and he was still recovering. He also had a bad knee. He was not back to his usual physical condition and wouldn't have been up to traveling. Susan wrote, quote, whenever I think of Larry walking away from his house and leaving his kids behind, I know it's not true because he would never leave his kids. I know Larry would only leave his life if it was taken from him. On January 8th, now in 2010, Susan learned that Larry's kids, Bree and Brian, both adults, had also been unable to reach him and were very concerned. They found out that a car Larry had recently purchased from a friend had mysteriously been returned, with Ladena claiming that Larry had decided he didn't want it. When they tried to file a missing persons report in Yakima, police told them that Larry had been the subject of a domestic violence report filed on January 5th by Ladena. As the officer described it to the family, Ladena reported an assault by Larry on January 4th, but it was a he said, she said situation. This report never led to charges because Ladena wasn't injured in any way, and the police never made contact with Larry. So it was actually just allegations made by Ladena that were never really followed up on. But Larry remained missing. And after he failed to call one of his and Susan's sisters for her birthday, on January 10th, the family filed a missing persons report at the Yakima Police Department for Larry. Yakima PD learned from Ladena that after the alleged assault on the night of January 4th, Larry had left on foot, leaving his wallet, car, and other personal possessions with the exception of his cell phone behind. And no one in the family had heard from him since Christmas. Larry was recovering from surgery on his neck and needed a knee replacement. If he left, why would he not take his car? Well, police wondered the same thing. Police tried to recreate Larry's timeline starting on Christmas Day, 2009. On Christmas morning, his mother Cecilia stopped by his house just blocks from her own to drop off some Christmas gifts for the 57-year-old, including a pair of Adidas sweatpants. They spoke then, and he called her later that day to thank her for the gifts. They knew he had made Christmas dinner at home that day. His girlfriend Ladena was at her sister's house, a Christmas tradition. Larry made a special Christmas dinner and waited for her. He made lots of phone calls, talking to his friends in other states. Nothing seemed amiss, according to all those friends, other than that he mentioned that Ladena was hours late for dinner. He also spoke to the renter on the farm property, an associate of Ladena's, who owed back rent amounting to $6,000. Larry spoke to his son Brian around 4 o'clock. The family obtained and reviewed Larry's phone records from December 1st, 2009 to January 1st, 2010, and saw that Larry had made 3 calls between 5:16 p.m. and 5:23 p.m. on Christmas Day. The last call was the one where he called his mom to thank her for the gifts. Ladena and her sister came home, and they finally ate the Christmas dinner Larry had made. After that, Larry was not heard from again. Calls from Brian to his father later that night went unanswered. Larry's phone was not used again except for 3 less than 1 minute long calls made from the phone between Christmas and January 25th. These all placed the phone in the neighborhood where Larry and Ladena lived. It has never been found. Susan learned from neighbors of Larry and Ladena that at the end of December and into January, they had witnessed Ladena moving many large boxes and items out of the home she shared with Larry. The Riegel family took extensive steps to find their missing brother and loved one. They paid for a private investigator to try to find him. A volunteer cadaver dog was used to examine a spot on a nearby property where they thought Larry could have been buried, but the dog detected nothing. They set up billboard after billboard and kept his case in the media. Now they have come to believe that Larry met with foul play. Unfortunately, the police failed to investigate Larry's case for nearly 4 years. It's not clear why this took 4 years, but in May of 2013, Ladena was charged with a felony for using Larry's electronic benefits card multiple times in the weeks after he'd been reported missing. According to reports, she collected approximately $1,500 in financial assistance she was not entitled to. The Yakima Herald reported that Ladena was charged with welfare fraud, perjury, and false verification. She claimed that she did the grocery shopping in the relationship and expected Larry to return home, so she needed to have food waiting for him. Ladena avoided jail time for these charges. She was sentenced to a diversion program and ordered to reimburse the state for the funds she had misappropriated. The Yakima Herald reported that Ladena completed those requirements in February of 2014. Yakima police have stated publicly that they consider Ladena Mann a person of interest in Larry's disappearance. They believe she was one of the last persons to see him alive, and that she has provided dissatisfactory explanations for his whereabouts. Yakima Police Detective Nolan Wentz picked up the Larry Riegel case in late 2013. Per Detective Wentz's orders, police searched Ladena's home and her sister's home in Moxie. Nothing was found, but the missing persons investigation has become a death investigation. Now retired, Lieutenant Wentz told Dateline frankly that he believes Larry was the victim of a homicide. He confirmed that police have multiple persons of interest in Larry's case, and his ex-girlfriend Ladena is one of them. Police have not named the other two persons of interest, but the family believes that one is possibly the renter whom Larry called on Christmas, right before he vanished. This renter has since passed away. He owed Larry $6,000, and Larry had called him numerous times right before he disappeared, demanding payment. Lieutenant Wentz retired in June of 2016, but he continues to stay in touch with the family and work on the case. On December 15th of 2019, Larry Riegel would have turned 67. As of 10 days later, he was missing for 10 years. In commemoration of Larry, on the 10th anniversary of his going missing, his family erected a billboard in Union Gap with a big photo of a smiling Larry and the words, "Remember me? 10 years and the search continues." The billboard announced the new $25,000 reward being offered in Larry's case and requested tips about the location of his remains to be called in to the Yakima PD. Susan says that she and the rest of the family have resigned themselves that Larry is dead. They believe his remains are somewhere in the lower valley. Their only goal at this point is to recover Larry's remains and inter him at Calvary Cemetery, where the extended family is buried. As of now, the reward stands at $50,000, specifically for information leading to the whereabouts of Larry's remains. Larry has missed more than 15 years of family events, including the birth of 2 grandchildren and the death of his son Brian. The family has started a Facebook page dedicated to finding Larry called Larry Riegel Missing, where you can keep up with developments and check out photos of Larry and his family. Mike Morford sat down to talk with Susan about her missing brother Larry's case. That conversation is coming up after a word from our sponsors.
Hi, Susan, and welcome to Missing Persons. Thanks for coming on to talk about Larry's case with us.
Thank you, Mike, for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and we're happy to shed some more light on the case if we can and keep the word out there that it's still ongoing investigation. Your brother Larry's been missing for, 14 years now? He's missing under some pretty strange circumstances, which we'll dive into.
Yeah, 15 years. It was 15 years.
Okay.
On December 25th, 2024. He went missing on Christmas Day, Christmas evening of 2009.
So this must be a tough time of year for you and your family as this approaches.
Oh, it's horrible. It really is. And Larry's birthday is December 15th. So, we've got his birthday that's reminding us every year. And then we have Christmas, which is always a little bit overshadowed.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about some of the details surrounding his disappearance. But before we do, can you talk a little bit about Larry himself, what he was like and what you remember about him?
Yeah, gladly. I was very close with my brother. I'm the youngest of 5, and my brother was right between 4 girls. So we have 2 older sisters, and then we had Larry, and then we have 2 younger sisters, and me being the youngest. And Larry was always, he was a good big brother, protective of me. As I got older and became a teenager and young adult, and through my rest of my lifetime, we did all kinds of stuff together. We boated together. We camped together. We hung out. Friday night, I just drive over his friends, with his friends, I just hang out there. And he was just really, he was a very important part of my life, um, always. And I miss him. I miss him a lot.
In that time that he went missing in 2009, what was going on in his life? Anything out of the ordinary, anything unusual that maybe a sign of things that might come, things that might happen, being something you could look back on and say, that was kind of off.
Yeah. So my brother was a bush pilot. He had a plane, and he was a hunter. He had friends all over in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and he would fly into remote areas. And he also was a big risk taker. In other words, he loved to snowmobile, but it wasn't just snowmobiling. He was uh, pretty intense on it. And then water skiing. He was a very good water skier. And of course, with that comes wipeouts and things like that. So over the years, my brother had a neck injury from the snowmobiling and, everything else that was going on. And it got to a point where he was having quite a few issues with paralysis, and medically he just was not doing well, and he couldn't work. He had had a construction company all his life, and he couldn't do that any longer. So he had a major neck surgery. They fused C3, 4, and 2, 3. And that was October 7th of 2009. And that was a pretty major surgery. And so he was recovering from that. He was in a pretty vulnerable state physically during that recovery. And so even though he was a really big guy, he was 6'4" and 225 pounds, very muscular. He was compromised, because of that surgery. And he was having, like, his arms and hands would go numb, and he couldn't feel them sometimes. And so those types of things were going on at Christmas time. In addition to that, he and his girlfriend were not getting along. We had a family farm out on the Yakima reservation. And after my stepdad passed away, my mom, she was 80. She needed to move into Yakima and not be 20 miles outside of town and several miles from her nearest neighbor. So she had planned on giving the farm to my brother when she passed away. And that was fine with all of us girls. We didn't care. It was pretty remote. And so when he met this girlfriend, she had recommended a person to live in the farmhouse and rent it. And Larry moved into Yakima and lived with the girlfriend at her property, which was about 3 blocks from my mom's house. They weren't getting along, and my brother was wanting to, break up and move out, but he was having a hard time with money because of his surgery and stuff. And so he was trying to raise funds so that he could move out and be on his own. And so that's, that was a complicating factor, was money. And then in addition, and the farm in itself, and that's a whole nother story. But in addition, I know that he was in conversation for the last 3, 4 months to reunite with an old girlfriend that our family held very dear to our hearts. Larry had been with her for 17 years, and it looked like they were going to get back together.
So
So that
it
was kind of what
sounds
was going on.
like he had a lot of stuff going on then between his health and financial issues and romantic issues. He's got a
Mm-hmm.
lot of stuff sort of going on all at once.
Yep.
Um, I want to go back to I guess the last known time when anybody in your family talked to him. That was Christmas night, 2009.
Yeah, it was Christmas night. Um, the um, the last known conversation was between he and my mom at around 5:30, 6 o'clock. My brother called her to thank her for his Christmas presents. My mom had gone and bought him. Now, this is a 58-year-old man. She bought him some Adidas sweatpants so that he could be comfy while he was recovering. And so he had called her and they'd spoke and he had thanked her. That's the last known conversation. Before that, it was around 4 o'clock, and he talked to his son.
Okay.
But throughout the day, he had talked to everybody, all of his friends, Wyoming, Montana, Alaska. I mean, I've talked to all of his friends, and my brother was a very gregarious person. He was a talker. He could talk to anybody. There was no such thing as a stranger to him. He'd walk into a bar, he'd buy somebody a beer, he'd sit down and he'd talk to him, about where they were from, what they did, what, et cetera, et cetera. He could just talk to anybody. That was his personality.
And during those conversations that he had with everybody that he talked to on that Christmas day, were any of the conversations, alarming? Was he having any trouble? Did he mention anything being worrisome, or was everything pretty much normal for Christmas conversation?
Everything was normal. He was very upbeat. He was talkative. He was happy. He was holding Christmas dinner for his girlfriend to come home. She was with her sister, which was very normal. They always spent Christmas together for a little bit, just the two sisters. So Larry was holding dinner, and he did mention that to every person that he talked to, that she was, an hour late, then she was 2 hours late, then she was 3 hours late. And he was very worried about his bird drying out. And so he was just very talkative. The only thing, like I, mentioned, is just that he was holding dinner and he was worried about his bird drying out, his gravy not turning out good, etc. But everything
Okay.
else was normal.
And then the next day, he's supposed to have dinner with your family, but he doesn't show up. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes,
how
exactly.
quickly, did you immediately say, okay, something's wrong here, or did your family start saying, well, maybe he got busy, maybe he got tied up with something? What was the initial thoughts about
No.
him not being there?
So on the afternoon of the 26th, so I didn't live in Yakima. I lived in a town called Snohomish. And so my husband and I were driving to Yakima, and I called my brother on the way, and he didn't pick up. And then all the family started to arrive at my mom's about 5:30. And by 7 o'clock, Larry hadn't gotten there for dinner. So I called his home. Like I said, he's just like 4 blocks from the house, from my mom's house. So I call him, and this time his girlfriend answers and said Larry wasn't there. And she said he'd left for the coast to visit friends the night before. Now, people in central Washington and eastern Washington refer to the coast as anything west of the Cascades. So it doesn't mean that it's necessarily on the ocean. So she said he had gone over to Seattle on Christmas night. And I said, well, I was home. Why didn't he call me? And she said that he had friends over there and was going to stay with him. And then she said Larry was a little blue, and that's the word that she used. Well, he's a little bit blue because he hadn't spoken with his kids on Christmas Day, and he decided just to go. And then she also told me on the phone that he was being treated for a brain disorder and that he'd been blue for a while. And I'm like, a brain disorder? What's that mean? And she said, well, it's not really a disorder, it's complicated. And I said, well, it's doesn't make sense. He hates driving in Seattle. He hates Seattle, period. This is a country boy, and he doesn't like going into the city at all. And I said, why would he go over there? I mean, I said, what friends? I know all of his friends. And she said, oh, I don't know. He just has friends over there. I knew immediately, Mike, immediately, that something was wrong. Okay. The whole story that she was saying was not plausible, and it did not have any threads of truth in it. And I said, well, you and I probably need to talk, and I'll come over tomorrow or, before I go back to Snohomish on Monday. And I asked for my brother, to call me when he got back, which he never did, of course.
So was it the next day you drove there and went to see her in person?
Yeah. So on Monday, the 28th, I went there. I drove over there I was headed out of town to head back home. And so I went to their house. I got there at 10:30. And what I noticed first off is when I drove up, it had snowed the night before, and there was fresh snow everywhere. No, tire tracks in or out of the driveway. There was one set of footprints that went out to the newspaper box, but there was nothing else. And when I went into the house, and this is a double modular home model, let's see, it's not a modular home, it's a trailer, but it's a double wide. And so when I went in there, it was picked up. Now, I know this sounds catty, but she was not a good housekeeper at all. She was a filthy housekeeper. And it really bothered my brother because he was very much a neat neck. And the house was clean. It was all picked up and clean. And anyway, I put my brother's birthday presents on the dining room table, and I sat in his recliner chair in the living room. I never left that spot. I didn't go into the kitchen, bathroom, or any other area in the house. And then we proceeded to have a visit. So go ahead.
I guess you wanted to confront her and ask her about this situation where he supposedly went to see some friends, and I'm curious what she had to say and what her attitude was like, and
Oh,
was
yeah.
she completely normal acting or was something off?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to kind of go back and let you know that I wrote and kept track. I have a report of investigation, a written statement that I kept a running. Every time I talked to somebody, I'd put down the date, time, location, everything they said, what we discussed. And that is like a 75-page declaration. And so if it sounds like I'm, just reading from something, I am referring to that. And thank God I did it, Mike, because I was diagnosed with a brain tumor like 5 years ago, and it's been very stable except this year. And so there are things, even though I always had a really good memory, there are things sometimes that I don't remember. I can't remember a word, or I can see it, but I can't remember it. So thank God I have this documentation of everything that I did back then.
Yeah, it's sort of like what the police do because, 20, 30 years from now, when another detective is working on a case, they want to see what was noted. So it's a good idea that you did that.
Yeah, And
for
I
your
did
own
it.
purposes and for anyone that might need to
Yes.
see it.
And I did it because I have a very close friend whose husband, her and her husband are both retired FBI. They live in Florida, and I reached out to them, within that first couple of weeks. And he said, hey, you need to write down all your notes, keep very, very close track of everything that's going on. And so thank goodness he told me that. And that's what I did.
Beautiful Anonymous changes each week. It defies genres and expectations. For example, our most recent episode, I talked to a woman who survived a murder attempt by her own son. But just the week before that, we just talked the whole time about Star Trek. We've had other recent episodes about sexting in languages that are not your first language, or what it's like to get weight loss surgery. It's unpredictable, it's real, it's honest, it's raw. Get Beautiful Anonymous wherever you listen to podcasts.
So yes, let me go back now. The conversation that we had, first thing I asked was about the brain disorder. And she kept saying, well, it wasn't really a disorder, but that he'd been depressed. I asked if he was taking medications for depression. She said no. She said that Larry was depressed, that nobody had called him, and that he had had to call everybody else himself. And I'm thinking, baloney. That has never been a problem. My brother likes to be on the phone, visiting with people. If he can't be in his car going to visit people, then he's on the phone talking to him. And then she said that he needed money. So he decided he would go to the coast. He would take some old jewelry to a pawn shop over there, and because he would get more money for it over there. Then she said he was going to take the money and gamble or play poker so he could win more money. And she said he was insistent on going. And so she packed a couple of t-shirts for him, gave him clean underwear, packed his toothbrush, put his jewelry in a Ziploc bag so he wouldn't lose any of it. And I remember distinctly her making this little closing gesture when she mentioned the Ziploc bag. It was just weird. Then she said he was going to stay with friends and he was going to be back on Monday, the 28th, when his son came back from Portland. And I said, well, does Brian know his dad's in Seattle? And she said, no. And I said, well, he would have called me if he was in Seattle on Christmas Day because I was home. We have 5 kids, my husband and I. And so we had big Christmases back then. She kept insisting he was going to stay with friends. She didn't know who they were. She just kept reiterating the same thing over and over. So then I asked if he had his cell phone, and she said he did have it, but that he didn't have his charger, so he wouldn't have any battery life left. Then she just continued to tell me he was depressed and stressed out. He needed money for taxes and water on the farm, that he was buying from our mom. And I just kept saying, repeating, Larry hated driving in Seattle. He would never go over there on a whim. Then she went on to tell me this long and complicated story about Larry not trusting his son, Brian. And she went on and on and on about Brian couldn't be trusted and he couldn't be at the house and couldn't be there, etc. Then she told me about money that my mom borrowed from her, $900, and that my mom wouldn't pay it back, etc., etc. And this was so weird. She said that my mom told her she was having checks bouncing in her checking account and she needed this money. So Ladena brings it over and my mom meets her at the door, grabs the money out of her hand, turns around, locks the front door, gets in her car and drives off. And she keeps saying that she knew as soon as my mom grabbed that money from her that she'd never get repaid on it. It was just an odd story. Then she said my brother had taken $2,700 from her on a horse sale. And she kept saying that she couldn't pay her bills because all this money was missing. And it really got to a point, Mike, where I was ready to take out my checkbook and write a check for all this money that she was accusing my family of stealing. And the only thing that stopped me was I thought I need to talk to my husband because I was getting too emotional there. And then the last thing she talked about was that she wanted my mom to sell the farm to one of her neighbors so Larry wouldn't be burdened with trying to care for the farm. And she felt having the farm sold would keep Larry from having to worry about taxes, water, give everybody some money, etc. And that did happen. I vaguely remember my mom mentioning a similar story to me about a year or two beforehand. My brother worked for Cub Crafters, which is a small plane, company, and out of Yakima, and he would either deliver planes, sometimes cross country. He'd fly from Washington to Florida or down into Louisiana or California or Texas. He'd fly and pick up parts. Sometimes he'd fly a commercial jet there and then pick up a plane and fly it back into Yakima. And it was on one of those business trips that Ladena came over and started kind of badgering my mom about selling this farm, and that she said that she had a buyer for the farm and, et cetera. And my mom was really upset about it, that she was putting her nose between, into her and Larry's business. Now, I didn't mention this, but at this point, they had only been together. Were only together a total of about 2 years. So there wasn't like this big, long relationship going on. So about an hour and a half, goes by, and I just said, well, have Larry call me. And she asked me to hold her confidence on everything we discussed and not say anything to Larry, Brian, my mom, or anything else. And I agreed. Okay, well, that was a big lie because I was not going to not talk about this. But my impression of the entire visit was that her stories were very odd. They were not in line with Larry's personality and habits. They were random. They were all over the board. I thought the stories right at the time were lies while she was talking to me. And while there may have been some threads of truth in some of them, the details were completely untrue. And I wondered about the unusual way she gave me details about packing his bag on Christmas night, the jewelry, the little Ziploc bag, and him playing poker. My brother liked a good card game, but he was not into high stakes poker, and he certainly didn't have money to risk losing money. That was so far-fetched. I couldn't even, it was, yeah. And then the other thing is that while she was talking to me, I'm sitting in my brother's recliner. She's on the couch. She's laughing. She's very animated during the entire visit. Too much for the stories she was telling me. Like she kept bouncing around on the couch and kind of laughing, and just her actions did not fit with what she was telling me. And up to that time, I didn't have any reason not to like her. I liked her. We had a lot of things in common. We are both gardeners. We love animals. We always had a nice visit. And I did that mostly for my brother because I was close to him and I wanted to be at the house and visit with him, etc. But I was so mentally and emotionally exhausted by the time I left. I got out to the car and I called my husband and I just started bawling. And I said, something is wrong. Something is bad, bad wrong. I don't know where Larry is, and I'm scared. And he said, just come home and we'll talk about it.
Hmm.
And I'd lived in Western Washington. After I finished college, I moved over there for work, which most people do. I'd lived over there since '86. And in that time, from '86 to 2009, I'd known my brother to come over there 4 times. Once to bring his kids for school shopping, and I went with them. Once when my mom had knee replacement surgery. Again, I was with him. Once to attend my wedding. And most recently, in September of 2009, I had gotten him an appointment at Harborview for getting a second opinion on that big neck, surgery and fusion.
Hmm.
So it's not like he ever went over there. He didn't like it. Too much traffic, you know.
So your gut was telling you that something wasn't right here with everything you were hearing. How long after your visit with her did you report him missing?
Okay, so I did not. So what happened is from the December 28th, I kept calling and leaving messages for my brother on his cell phone and couldn't reach him. And
I saw, not to interrupt you, but I saw one report that you had tried calling him 75 times.
yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, there is an incredible amount of voicemails, and it totally blew up his phone. Um, but by January 8th, which was a Friday, so January 8th of 2010, I had two friends, a couple that I'd known for a long time. They brought my mom, my 80-year-old mother, over to Western Washington because my son was a musician and he was playing at a venue. And so they brought her over so that she could see him perform. And I took first of all, when when my mother walked into the venue, the first thing she said to me is, "Oh my God, I'm so worried about your brother. I've been calling, and I can't reach him. And I don't know anybody that has talked to him, since Christmas." And I said, "Oh, it'll be okay, Mom. Don't worry about it. Just, we're here to listen to Jacob play music and blah, blah, blah." But I took my friend aside. Now, this tells you how much happens with technology. They had gotten brand new iPhones, first time they came out at Christmas 2009. And her and her husband had them. They hardly knew how to work them because they were brand new onto the market. And so she went onto her little iPhone and we started looking up phone numbers in Yakima for my brother's friends. And so I didn't tell my brother, but my friend and I had been friends since the 3rd grade. She knew my brother very, very well. She agreed with me, something's not right. He's not returning phone calls. Your mom's not heard from him. That's even if he was flying into Alaska or wherever, everybody knew where he was going. He would call people when he got there. I mean, he was just a talker and he was in touch with his family. So we started making calls that night. So first thing I did is I called my nephew and said I hadn't been able to reach his dad. And he was very worried and very angry with Ladena, the girlfriend. He felt that she was intentionally keeping his messages from him. She thought that he had, was somehow being kept away from his dad, period. He said he'd last spoke to his dad on Christmas about 4 o'clock, and then he tried calling him again that night at 10 o'clock. And at 10 o'clock, between 10 and midnight, he made like 30 phone calls. Couldn't get a hold of him ever. And he said he was calling and leaving messages on the house phone, on Ladena's cell phone, on Larry's cell phone, and he wasn't hearing back from anybody. And he said a few times when he called, Ladena would say his dad was sleeping and couldn't come to the phone. So, okay, so he's sleeping, but when he wakes up, he should have called. Next, I called his daughter, my niece, and discovered she hadn't been able to reach her dad either. And she was worried, and she actually talked to her husband about filing a missing persons report, but did not. And then I called his best friend, Ray, and Larry was buying a Volkswagen diesel. It had some kind of a boost engine. It was like all zooped up. Anyway, he was buying that from Ray. He only had less than a half a dozen payments on it. But Ray said that he came home to his house and he found Larry's car in his driveway with the keys in it. And he couldn't get a hold of Larry. And when he did get a hold of Ladena, she just said, well, he's not going to make any more payments on it. And so he's just going to give it back to you. And Ray wanted to talk to Larry and could never reach him. So then I hung up. I called one of my sisters and I asked her to file a missing persons report. And she did call Yakima police and they came over and they said there was no more missing persons case because there was a report of a domestic violence issue at Larry's house on Monday, January 4th. And this officer told my sister that they had contact with Larry and that he'd left the house and was probably just quote unquote laying low for a few days. So then I asked my sister to call one of the local taverns and to see if he was down there, and that went nowhere. So then on Saturday the 9th, I called both my niece and nephew. I called one of my sisters whose birthday is December 31st, and my brother always called her on her birthday. And she said, I didn't get a call from Larry this year. And so we heard about this domestic from the police department. And so they did not want to do a missing persons report. This would have been on that Friday, I think the 8th. They didn't want to do one. And so between the 8th and the 10th, when I finally came to Yakima, I decided after I talked to the female officer that actually did the intake on the domestic, when I spoke with her, she said, look, she said, there's no domestic because one, there was no physical evidence. Ladena had a partial plate in the front. She had lost several of her teeth years before this, like 10, 15 years before, and she would glue them back into her partial plate. So the police knew that. She had no other physical evidence, no bruising, no cuts on the inside of her mouth or anything that would be there if she had gotten hit there. And then in addition, they never made any contact with Larry, so nobody saw him. And so it was, her name is Officer Esther Sear, and she said, I think you need to come to Yakima right now and file a missing persons report. And so that's what I did. My husband drove me over and we went to so this is Sunday night. We went and we filed it that night. And then I stayed over. And Monday the 11th, then they assigned a detective and I made contact with him.
So this timeline, this is a little weird, and I just want to recap for listeners. So you talked with her in person, face to face on, what was that, the 10th? Or
Who? The officer or
no, I'm sorry. I have my dates mixed up. Um, you had spoken to Larry's girlfriend on the
December 28th?
the 28th,
Mm-hmm.
and now it's the 10th or thereabouts, and you find out this report she's filed is from the 5th.
Yes. It supposedly happened on the 4th, and she walked into the police station on January 5th.
So according to her, Larry came back from wherever he was, did this to her. She files a report, but now he's missing again.
Yeah, so she says on the evening of January 4th, which was the night supposedly he hit her, he beat her up, and then he walked out the door. He left his wallet, he left his car keys, he didn't take his car, and he just walked out into the night, and she never saw him again. That is her story. That, he beat her up and then he walked out on the 4th. And
Now,
go ahead.
I understand that's her story. Did the police believe her story as far as you know? Did they question her about him being missing? And is there any reason to be suspicious for her story?
They didn't question her until we filed the report on the evening of the 10th. 11th into the 11th. And it was after we told them, and there were several people now, several family members who were coming forward and saying, nobody had seen him. Nobody except Ladena had seen or spoke to him since December 25th. And that's when the police said, well, first the detective, this annoyed me so much. He said, well, Larry's probably hiding because he thinks he's going to get in trouble for the domestic. And I said, no, you don't know my brother. He would not be hiding. He'd be here in everybody's face saying, I never touched her. She's lying. I said, and that's how he is. He would never just go off and hide. And he was in a vulnerable state. He could hardly walk. His left knee needed his right knee needed another major knee replacement surgery. Plus, he was healing from the neck surgery with numb arms and hands. And he's got a car there on the property, and he's going to walk out into the night on January 4th when there's snow and it's freezing. No. And so she called a friend of hers to come over, she was crying, and we talked to this friend later, and she was interviewed by the police. She doesn't drive. She had lost her driver's license for DUIs, and her son brought her over. Now her son, what a nice young man. He was a former Marine. He was just a super, super nice young man in his late 20s. And he walked out and tried to find Larry. Now my brother at that point was like 4 blocks from my mom's house. So this kid walks over to my mom's house. Larry's not there. He walks back. He walks all around in the neighborhood. He doesn't see any footprints in the snow that anybody's come out of the house and walked down the street, into the night. And so he was pretty critical when that first detective never interviewed him. It wasn't until 3 years later when we got a new police chief that kid was finally found and interviewed. And he said, I looked at her. He goes, she didn't have any marks on her. There was nothing disturbed in the house. He said there were no footprints in the snow leading out, and down the road. And he agreed. Why wouldn't Larry take his car? He drove his car everywhere. He did not walk. He wasn't a walker. Unless he was hunting or something, he was not one to go for a leisurely stroll.
Hmm.
So that was her.
Yeah, and the story just seems kind of suspicious that he's missing. He comes back to her, only she sees him. She has this encounter with him where she alleges that he, you know, beat her, and then he disappears again. The story itself does seem awfully fishy.
Doesn't it?
Um, it does. And can you remind me? You mentioned some of his belongings were found in his home. Was his phone found?
No, the phone was never found, but we did get and get this, the police wouldn't pay the couple $100 to get all the phone records from, I think he had Verizon at the time. And so we paid for, or no, he had AT&T. The family, I personally wrote a check and paid for it to get all the phone records. And
Wow.
when we did, there were 3 phone calls made after December 25th. All 3 phone calls were less than a second. So, but they bill for, it was just, I shouldn't say less than a second, less than a minute, because that's the least amount of time that they would bill on a phone. So if it was only 30 seconds or 20 seconds, they're still going to bill you for 1 minute. He had 3 phone calls, all for this 1 minute at different times up until like the 5th of January. And we later determined that all 3 of those phone calls pinged off of the neighborhood tower by Larry's house.
So they were probably made in that area. Where were the calls to, or who were they to?
1 call was to the former girlfriend. 1 call was to me. And 1 call was to his son. And like, if my phone had rang, I would have picked it up in a heartbeat. But what I was told at that time by AT&T is that if somebody does like 1 ring, so they call your number and they let it ring 1 time or even 2 times, and then they hang up before it gets answered, then it never rings on the other end.
Okay.
So, because nobody else, the old girlfriend, that he was talking to, and then his son and myself, none of us heard our phones ring.
Hmm. So you've sort of gone over how, even right to this last thing, you said that you had to pay for the phone records, which in a police investigation seems kind of disturbing. But um, it sounds like maybe the best investigation wasn't done early on. But in 2013, I know that the case again sort of got a little bit of rejuvenation. I think that it was Detective Nolan Wentz picked up Larry's case.
Mhm.
Um, did you see an improvement in the investigation of it then?
Yes, absolutely. So after the police chief was fired during the time that Larry went missing, and we got a new chief, um, uh, my husband and my sister and I went in and we asked for a meeting, and we got one. And he came in with his detectives, and he's the one that, I had all these questions. Why was his house never searched? Why was there never, because they said, well, what did we not do? Well, you never searched his house. You never searched his home. You never did a forensic analysis of his car. Even when the car got returned, they never went out there with luminol or anything. The guy looked in the car and he said, well, I found some pill bottles. I said, well, aren't you going to like test it forensically? He goes, oh, I don't think that's necessary. And so they never did that. They lost that opportunity. There was they didn't search the house at all. Again, the officer said, well, she let me walk through. So I just walked through and did a visual check, and everything looked fine. There were other things. So the kid that brought his mother over, I had all of his information. I said, go talk to him, because I did. And in fact, I walked up and down the block for 2 blocks in either direction of Larry's home, knocking on every door. And every person that opened their door, I talked to them. And I documented what time I was there, the address I was there, the people's names, their phone numbers. And I asked them, did you see or hear anything suspicious on Christmas night, or, any time up to January 5th? Because my theory is that he was killed or grievously wounded on the 4th. And they were figuring out how to dispose of his body. And I don't think it's just the girlfriend. I think the tenant that she had out on our farm, he had stopped paying rent. And he owed my brother about $6,000 in back rent. And my brother was very angry, very upset about that. So we know that the girlfriend eventually came home with her sister, and the sister and Ladena and Larry all ate dinner on Christmas evening around 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. And then there was nothing after that. And I think what happened, because, well, let me back up. We know that there was like 6 or 7 phone calls made to this tenant. And we even heard one of the voicemails my brother left. And that's why I know that his words could just peel paint sometimes. And I think what happened is they ate dinner, and he said, come on, to his girlfriend, we're going out to the farm, and I'm going to get my money from that SOB. And that guy, he was an older man. He had a criminal background, which my brother didn't know about. This is all stuff we found out after the fact. He had been firing his rifle across the street at the Native Americans that he did not like. There's a Yakima family that we grew up with, and there's 2 houses, probably about a half mile apart. And he was firing at the one, and they were exchanging gunfire. So the sheriff knew that. They had been called out there. And I think my brother got really mouthy, and he got angry. And I think the guy popped him. And I think, the girlfriend at the very least helped cover up the incident, the murder.
And we do have to point out here too that nobody has been charged here. Everybody is innocent until proven guilty, but
That's right.
nobody has been charged. But it does seem, to my ears at least, that if a girlfriend is involved in something like this, she would need help from a second person to dispose of a body. And I don't know how big she is, how strong she is, but you would think that there's a good chance she's going to need some help making Larry disappear in this situation. So it does seem likely that there would be a second person involved. Was that tenant, that man that you just mentioned, was he questioned by police, and was he cooperative?
He was questioned one time during those that first year. And he just said that, he hadn't seen Larry, and he told the police also that he knew that Larry would beat Ladena all the time. And, so he was kind of trying to back up, I think, her. And I said, well, okay, if that's true, why wasn't she reporting that? Why did she only report it on the 4th? I mean, there were just so many inconsistencies, it's just weird stuff. But he was questioned. They never searched the farmhouse until 3 years later. They never searched the farm. I hired well, I didn't even hire them. They came for free from Kitsap County. My girlfriend, that's the parole officer, she's also a search and rescue person, and she had a cadaver dog in training. And so she asked her friends, because she had 2 other people, and one of the dogs was an international dog. He would go into earthquake zones and really terrible circumstances and find remains. That dog came out. Tammy brought her out and they looked at the farm. We looked at another piece of property that was owned by, remember the gal that had to come out with her son driving her on January 4th? She was renting that property, and so we did a cadaver dog out there. We could not get onto Ladena's property and search. Yeah, but see, like YPD, they didn't even do a cadaver dog. They didn't do any kind of search whatsoever. There was like a few weeks, and they thought Larry had run away. And it wasn't until March of 2010, I got a phone call from the detective. He didn't even say, "Hi, this is so-and-so." He just, I pick up the phone and he says, "I believe you." And I said, "What?" And he goes, "I believe you. I think that, he's dead and she had something to do with it." And I just started crying. I'm at work. I fell apart. But after 3 months, the neighbors, when I talked to them, because I went back and talked to numerous neighbors in the neighborhood, they saw her moving bags and boxes and all kinds of stuff out of her house in those first few weeks of January, between the 25th and about January, let's say January 30th. I don't know that that's the exact date, but during that first month, the one neighbor said, "I thought she was moving out because she was taking so much stuff out." And I told the police that. They never went over. They never questioned because they'd never seen any of Larry's stuff. They'd never done any kind of forensic anything in that house. I don't know. It's just weird, Mike. I mean, they admit now that they messed up, but it doesn't help, because as you mentioned, in 2013, by the time we got Nolan involved, he was a godsend, let me tell you. And it was because of that new police chief who assigned a team to start looking. And they did they did a big check of that property and her sister's property out in Moxie. But by that time, everything's gone. Like she had cleaned. The officer in those first few months, he told me that one of the times he went there, she had a carpet cleaner and was cleaning in the house. And I was like, wow, this is the filthiest person I've ever known. Like she'd have moldy dishes in her kitchen, that kind of thing.
But all of a sudden she's a clean freak.
Yeah, all of a sudden she's cleaning her house. And I said, well, that's abnormal. I said, I said, why can't we get a search warrant? And he kept saying, oh, we don't have enough evidence. You can't just go in. But, well, he didn't have evidence because he was not doing his job.
Yeah. And is it true that she also tried to renew Larry's benefits months after he was missing?
This was the only decent thing that happened from that detective, is that my brother got some, they call them, it's EBT, it's an electronic benefit transfer. It's from the state. It's how they do like health and welfare type things and food stamps and things like that. And he found out that my brother had just gotten a card, and it's not very much, a few $100s maybe a month for food. It's a food card. That's all you can buy on it. It's a food debit card. And so he had the state check to see if there's any activity on it, because if my brother had run away and was hiding, he'd still have to eat. And there was activity on it. There was 3 transactions on it. And so then they found out that Ladena also had a food card. And so then they pulled the camera footage, and they saw her using her card at like one grocery store, and then she'd drive way across town and she would use my brother's card and buy more groceries. And so she was charged. That's a felony. And at the time we had a different DA, and he charged her. And he charged her with 2 felonies. And he told me, look, we're going to do 2 felonies because Washington State has a thing called 3 strikes, you're out. And so he said, if anything happens with your brother and it's a 3rd felony strike, he said, she'll get prison time. She's not going to get probation or a slap on the wrist or anything else. She'll get prison time. And so I was pretty excited about that. But yeah, it showed her. And so she went to court, she had to go to court, and I was there when she was sentenced. And she just said that that when Larry came home, he would expect food to be in the pantry. One, they don't have a pantry in that mobile home. And 2, that's so unlike my, it was just so ridiculous, some of the things that she said. But here's the other thing, Mike, that I think is really worth, talking about. That farm that we grew up on, my mom had given it to my brother. He was going to pay her $500 a month, which was her house payment of this little house that she bought in Yakima. So Larry would have the farm. He'd pay $500 a month to my mom, basically her house payment. And then when she passed away, he would get the farm free and clear. So he was going to inherit the farm. And so any payment he was making was just, temporary. And so he was charging the tenant $500 a month. And he was just passing that through basically to my mom. But the tenant had stopped, paying rent. And as I said, he was $6,000 in the rear, and my brother was trying to get the money from him. And so after Larry disappears, Ladena took my mom to court 3 times trying to get title to the farm. Because the first time she said that she told the court that she gave Larry the down payment to buy the farm. And I was there, and the judge said, well, do you have a bill of sale? I mean, you have a contract? Or no, it was just a verbal, agreement that he was going to buy the farm. And the judge said, well, do you have something showing that money came out of your checking account? And she said, no, I only deal in cash because I don't make enough money to have a bank account. But she had $30,000 cash to give to my brother for the down payment on this farm. And
Wow.
the judge said, well, then there's no proof. And my mom said, I wasn't going to say, she brought her will in with her attorney. And she said, why would my son be buying the farm when he's going to get it free and clear? It didn't make sense again. And so she did that once. The first time she did it because my mom was trying to evict the tenant out of there because he wasn't paying and he was just squatting. And she told the judge that my mom had no rights because, Larry was buying the farm, and because he was gone now, it reverted to her, like a marriage, and the judge said, no, that's not how that works. And then she took my mom back to court a second time for title to the farm, tried to sue her for the farm. saying again that she owed her all this money. She brought up the $900. She brought up the $2,700. She brought up the $30,000, and she wanted my mom to pay all this back to her. And the judge said, no, you have no proof. You know, Mrs. Down, there's nothing going into my mom's bank account. She had no bank account. No, there was no money trail at all. It was just a he said, she said. The third time that she went to court to try to get title to the farm, the judge, she accused my mom of climbing over her back fence and putting a threatening note in her car that she was going to be next. Now, my mom is a cute little 5'1" kind of chubby grandma. And it was just laughable. I mean, people in the courtroom were laughing, you know, at the thought of looking at my mom and she's going to be scaling this back fence like Spider-Man to put this note.
One more thing that just doesn't sound realistic in this case.
So I still think about that. It is just so hysterical. But that third time, the judge said, look, you come back into my court one more time accusing Mrs. Downey of not paying you or trying to get title to her farm. He goes, I'm going to hold you in contempt. And that was the last one. But she did try to get a restraining order against my mom for allegedly scaling her fence. She also tried to, she filed for a restraining order against me. Well, my mom's got dismissed that third time in court, but they hadn't served me papers yet up in Snohomish. And so like a week later, I come home and there's a Snohomish County sheriff sitting in my driveway, and he gets out and he, you know, serves me this restraining order. And I said, oh, this is perfect. I said, I love this. Thank you very much for bringing it to me. I'm a lot different than my mom. And so first thing I did is I went to my attorney and I said, okay, I want to go to court on this. And I said, and she's saying that I'm harassing her, you know, through the, you know, making phone calls and computer and blah, blah, blah. Well, we couldn't get any kind of, you know, we couldn't get any records. The police kept saying, oh, there's not enough evidence. We can't subpoena, you know, any of these records of her phones and stuff. So she filed a restraining order against me. So I said, okay, I want all of her phone records. I want all of her email records. I want, you know, I just listed. I went boom, 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 boom. And, you know, had her served with that response through the courts, and she dropped everything. So that was really disappointing. I was hoping we could go through a back door and get all that information. It wasn't until Nolan took over, you know, 3 years later that we finally were able to get all of her records. And there were very weird phone calls going on with her and the tenant. And a lot of them, Christmas night and all during that week after Christmas and all after, you know, the 4th and 5th and up until we filed the missing persons report. And I do recall there was one time, it was on the 11th, I was standing in her living room with one of my sisters, and there were 2 detectives there, and she kept telling them, look, Larry takes off like this all the time. He just goes with people. I don't know where he goes. And then he doesn't tell me where he's going, and I don't hear from him. And I said, that's not true. You know, I interrupted and I said, that's not true. Larry never goes more than 2 or 3 days and he's calling me. I mean, and my brother had an alcohol problem, and we called him the drunk dialer, but he was a happy drunk. And so he would call and you'd be on the phone for an hour with him, and he would just be talking and talking and talking and about everything under the sun. And so I told that to the detective while we were in the living room, And she said, well, that's not true. He doesn't call. He just goes off the grid. And finally he looked at Ladena and he said, well, I think he goes off the grid with you, but he doesn't go off the grid with his family. He is in touch with everyone in his family.
So it's almost like they didn't believe in. Now I know the latest detective also said, sometime back that there were persons of interest in this case, but he didn't name them publicly. Did he share any of that with you, what he thinks, or maybe who he thinks, without saying any names?
Yeah, I mean, they are kind of in line with me, and I'm with them on what we think happened. And that's what I disclosed. You're right. Nobody's been charged. Okay. And we are in the process right now of trying, to have a grand jury brought together to see if we can get an indictment. The tenant is deceased. And Ladena still lives in the same thing, and we think they work together on this. And I have told the Yakima Police Department in 2024 that at this point, I don't care about anything except my brother's body. I don't care if she gets charged. She's living in her own, hell. My husband says it's like Edgar Allan Poe's The Beating Heart. If you look at her, she is a shell of the person that she was when my brother was with her. She was very pretty. She was very tall and slim. She had very beautiful, long brown hair that reached down to her backside. And she was pretty. Now her hair is chopped off. She wears men's clothes. It's like she's in a disguise. She wears a hat all the time. You would never, ever in a million years know it's the same person. And Nolan thought the same thing. He said she's living in her own hell. Whatever happened, she is holding those cards close to her and she's not saying anything. And I told the detective, I said, I don't care if she blames everything on the tenant and just says, I was scared and I was just there and blah, blah, blah. I said, I don't care. Just have her say where the body is so we can recover his remains and have some closure for our 95-year-old mother. That's all we want.
Yeah, because you've already accepted that he's not alive, and you just want to be able to say a proper goodbye to him.
Exactly. Because my brother never in a zillion years would have walked out and left his kids, all of us. I mean, like I said, my brother was one of my very best friends. There wasn't anything I couldn't tell him.
Yeah.
And I think vice versa. We knew each other's secrets and we loved each other anyway. And he was just always so, so good to me growing up. He was just a great brother. And I just feel like I need to do this for him. I cannot let this rest. And I don't think the Yakima Police Department or the girlfriend ever thought I'd be this tenacious. But, we also, I probably spent about $15,000 just on billboards all around Yakima. And so people know him. I mean, I've had people come to my home, which is, 100 miles from Yakima now, and they'll come out of Yakima to like service my furnace or, water system or whatever. And I'll say, do you know the guy on the billboard, find Larry Riegel? Oh, yeah. My sister knew his daughter. I mean, that's how small Yakima is. And so everybody knows my brother, and they know that it's unresolved. And there's a lot of people that want some eyes put on this.
Sure.
And so it's not just the family. I mean, I've done everything I can to keep this out there. And with my health issues now, my niece is helping, and she's great. Very, she's very good at everything, with technology, I should say.
Well, you're keeping the word out there, which is important, and letting people know it's still unsolved. And sometimes people think, hey, I thought that case was solved, and maybe that person has heard a rumor or knew somebody that said something, and all these years later, with the passage of time, people die off. Maybe they're not afraid to talk. Maybe something like that will happen. Is there still a reward in this case?
Yeah, I had a $50,000 reward out there for the recovery of his body. I want it very specific. I don't care about information. I don't care about, just vague information or something that's going to get her, tried. This is $50,000 for his body. And as soon as I have his body recovered, I'll write a check.
Well, that sounds like sometimes that's what it takes to, make people, do something. It should be just out of the kindness of their heart because they want to help somebody, but sometimes money talks, and you never know in a case like this if that could be the difference between, finding something out and not finding it out.
Yeah, I've had that $50,000 out there now for 7, 8 years. And, I haven't had anything credible. But, the one thing Yakima police have not done, I have talked to the Yakima Nation tribal police. And at the time, there was a lieutenant by the name of Jimmy Shikes. Now he's the police chief out there. But he and I spoke on a number of occasions. There are very specific rules of engagement when you have a Anglo murder occur on the reservation. There are times when, like the FBI has to get involved and et cetera, et cetera. And they also have to be asked by Yakima police to get involved. And YPD has never invited Yakima County Sheriff. They've never invited tribal police, Washington State Patrol, the Attorney General's office, the FBI. Nobody. They've never invited another law enforcement agency onto this case to get fresh eyes or to help them with anything. So,
Well, it's never too late to try something new and see if you can get some different results and maybe have some success.
Exactly. That's my thought. I mean, what are you losing? At our last meeting we had with them, which was in the spring of 2024, they said, well, we just don't have a lot of resources. Well, if you don't have resources, all the more reason to reach out to one of these agencies to get resources. And I mean, I'm not in law enforcement, and yet that makes complete and total sense to me. Why would you not want to do that?
I think a lot of time there's pride involved or embarrassment or shame because, somebody couldn't solve the case on their own. They don't want to make it look like they're, needing help. But to a loved one, in your situation, you just want the case solved. You don't care, I'm sure, who solves it or if they need help solving it, as long as it gets solved. I think that's really all you're looking for.
That's exactly true, like 100%. I don't care who takes the credit or glory or anything else. All I care about is that my mom has her only son back in our little Catholic cemetery with all the rest of the family members, and then she can be at peace. We can all be at peace.
Yeah. Well, again, we'll do our part to help spread the word about the case that it's still unsolved, and hopefully people, especially in that area of Washington, are going to hear this and they'll share it on their social media and it'll get people talking, and hopefully it helps you get some answers.
Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate that. It feels very heartfelt, and I am very grateful to you and your organization for doing this podcast for us to help us keep the word out there.
Well, thank you for coming on and discussing Larry's case, and we'll definitely be out there for you trying to help spread the word.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Missing Persons. If you can provide any information to help solve the case we discussed in this episode, please contact the appropriate authorities.
If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to tell your friends about Missing Persons and invite them to listen to the show. Word of mouth will help us grow and bring these cases to a larger audience. You can also help us by taking a moment to rate and review Missing Persons on the platform you're listening to us now on. Just a reminder that new episodes of Missing Persons air every other Saturday. If you want to find us on social media, we're on Facebook at facebook.com/missingpersonspod. We're also on Twitter with the handle @missing_pod. And of course, you can find us and contact us through our website, missingpersonspodcast.com. On behalf of Jess Betancourt, this is Mike Morford saying thanks, and we'll see you next time on Missing Persons.